Marcus Brown, a black man living his ordinary life in the city, finds himself wrongfully detained by officers Collins and Edwards. But when Marcus's true identity comes to light, the entire precinct is left stunned. Who is Marcus Brown? And what makes the police realize that they are facing more than just a legal matter, a full confrontation with justice itself? Let's dive into his story. But before we begin, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, make sure to subscribe. It was an average morning in the bustling downtown. The sun rose slowly over the high-rise buildings, casting its first golden rays onto the awakening streets below. The city gradually stirred to life. Car horns blared, people chatted as they passed by, and the rich aroma of fresh coffee wafted out from local cafes. Amid the busy morning crowd, Marcus Brown moved with a calm yet confident air, his perfectly tailored suit and polished shoes making him stand out among the hurried commuters. In his early 30s, Marcus radiated an understated self-assurance. His hair was neatly groomed, his tie perfectly adjusted, and a warm smile graced his lips as he straightened his collar. Known for his approachable demeanor, Marcus had a way of lighting up a room without much effort. After enjoying breakfast at his favorite diner, Marcus felt satisfied. The staff knew him so well that they always remembered his favorite order: scrambled eggs, turkey sausage, and a plate of fresh fruit. As he walked towards his sleek black sedan parked on the street, Marcus felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulled it out and smiled at a message from his mom, reminding him about dinner plans that night. He quickly replied, reassuring her he hadn't forgotten and was looking forward to it. Family meant everything to Marcus, and he cherished every moment he could spend with them. Just as he unlocked his car, a shiny black sedan that he cared for meticulously, Marcus noticed two police officers walking towards him. Their expressions were difficult to read, and Marcus couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that swept over him. There was something in their fixed stares that hinted this wouldn't be a friendly encounter. Officers Collins and Edwards approached, their faces set with determination. Marcus's instincts immediately kicked in. He had grown up knowing the importance of staying calm in situations like this. His father had taught him well: never argue, make no sudden movements, and always show respect. Marcus took a deep breath, his heart beating faster as they stopped in front of him. "Sir, may we see your identification?" Officer Collins said, his voice carrying a sharp edge that Marcus recognized right away. No greeting, no explanation, just a demand. Marcus swallowed and nodded, carefully reaching for his wallet. "Is there a problem, officers?" Marcus asked calmly as he handed over his ID, trying to meet their gaze, but their faces remained hard. Edward stood slightly behind Collins, his hand resting near his holster, a position that made Marcus uneasy. Collins glanced at the ID, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you doing in this area?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Marcus frowned, confusion evident in his expression. "I just had breakfast at the diner down the street. I'm on my way to work," he replied honestly. "Is there a problem?" The officer ignored his question, instead taking a step closer, his presence becoming increasingly intimidating. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," Collins said, his tone accusatory. Marcus's stomach tightened. He knew this scenario all too well. It was something he'd heard of too many times before. A black man in an upscale neighborhood, wearing a suit. There must be something suspicious. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "There must be some mistake," he said slowly. Collins smirked, though there was no humor in it. "We'll see about that." "Step away from the car, please," he ordered. Marcus hesitated for a moment before complying, stepping back with his hands clearly visible. Edwards moved in, opening the car door and searching inside without a word of explanation. Marcus's heart pounded as he watched. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but that didn't seem to matter. A small crowd began to gather, people pausing on their way to work to see what was happening. Marcus could hear the murmurs, feel their eyes on him. He felt a mix of shame and anger rising within him, but he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to show anything that might escalate the situation. After a few tense minutes, Edward stepped back from the car, shaking his head. "Nothing here," he muttered, but Collins wasn't finished. He grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. "Hey, I haven't done anything wrong," Marcus protested, wincing in pain as Collins wrenched his arm. "You're resisting," Collins growled, pulling out his handcuffs. Marcus's heart sank. He knew that no matter what he said, it wouldn't change what was about to happen. The cold metal of the cuffs snapped around his wrists, unfeeling and final. Marcus looked up, catching the gaze of a woman across the street who had stopped to watch. She looked horrified, raising her phone to record what was happening. Marcus forced himself to stay calm. He had to believe that the truth would eventually come out, that justice would prevail, even if it didn't feel like it at the moment. As the officers led him towards the patrol car, Marcus kept his head held high. He knew this wasn't the end of his story. This was only the beginning of a fight he never wanted, but now had no choice but to face. Marcus Brown, now visibly anxious but still managing to stay calm, stood by his car as Officer Collins inspected his ID. The quiet morning had quickly turned into a tense situation. People hurried by, some casting curious glances while others looked away, but an uneasy feeling hung in the air. Collins examined Marcus's documents thoroughly, as if looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. Beside him, Officer Edwards kept watch, his hand threateningly near his holster. "Where are you coming from this morning?" Collins asked, his voice full of suspicion. Marcus stood firm, though he felt a knot tightening in his stomach with every passing second. "I just had breakfast at the diner down the street," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm on my way to work now." His voice was steady, but there was a hint of impatience beneath the surface. He wasn't used to being aggressively questioned just for existing in a public space, for simply being there. Collins's expression hardened as he stared at Marcus, clearly uninterested in his response. "The diner, huh? And what kind of work do you do?" He pressed as if trying to catch Marcus in a lie. "I'm an attorney," Marcus said, locking eyes with Collins to assert himself. He saw Collins's jaw tense at this answer, and Marcus wondered if the officer had been expecting or hoping for a different response, something that would confirm his current suspicions. A murmur rose from the onlookers who had begun to gather. The tension between the officers and Marcus was palpable, thick enough to cut. People started taking out their phones and pointing their cameras at the escalating scene. Marcus noticed the glowing screens being raised, and it gave him a small sense of reassurance that at least there would be witnesses. Collins's partner, Edwards, seemed to grow impatient, stepping forward. His attitude was hostile, his posture suggesting he was ready for a confrontation. "We received reports of suspicious activity in the area, and you match the description," Edwards added, eyes narrowing as if daring Marcus to make a wrong move. Marcus tried to steady his breathing, his father's words echoing in his mind. "Always stay calm. Always show respect." He raised his hand slightly, an instinctive gesture to show he meant no harm. "I understand, officer, but I assure you, I'm just trying to get to work." The crowd around them grew larger. An elderly man stopped near the curb, frowning at the scene. A young couple, holding hands, paused and whispered to each other, their brows furrowed with concern. The murmurs grew louder, and Marcus could feel the crowd's frustration and distrust building. But Collins seemed unfazed by the growing number of onlookers. Instead, he seemed to grow more rigid, more determined. He handed Marcus's ID back roughly, but then stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space. "We need to search your car," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't right. He hadn't done anything to warrant a search, and the way they were treating him was just wrong. "Officer, with all due respect, I do not consent to a search. I've complied fully, and I've done nothing wrong." Collins's smirk grew colder, something that sent a chill through Marcus. "Step away from the car," he said, ignoring Marcus's objection. Edwards moved closer, his hand now fully on his holster, the tension escalating instantly. Marcus swallowed, glancing quickly at the crowd. More people now, a sea of faces, some worried, some angry. He saw a young woman raising her phone, her expression determined. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on Marcus. He had to de-escalate, had to stay calm, had to think about what could come next. Things could quickly spiral out of control if he resisted. He carefully stepped back, his hands raised a bit higher. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but laced with frustration and fear. He stepped away from the car, and as he did, Collins moved in, signaling for Edwards to follow. Without any warning, Collins grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Hey, I'm not resisting," Marcus protested, his voice strained with pain. He felt the sharp ache in his shoulder as Collins twisted his arm, forcing him against the hood of the car. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," Collins said coldly, snapping the handcuffs around Marcus's wrists with a harsh click. The words felt surreal to Marcus. He wasn't resisting, he hadn't resisted. He had done everything they asked. The injustice of the situation washed over him like a wave of nausea, but he forced himself to stay silent, forced himself not to yell. From the crowd, there was a distinct gasp. The elderly man stepped forward, shouting, "He didn't do anything. Leave him alone." The young couple looked horrified, and the girl recording the scene yelled, "This isn't right. You can't just arrest him like that." The officers ignored them, shoving Marcus towards the patrol car. Marcus clenched his jaw, forcing himself to look straight ahead, to keep his head held high. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break down, even though he felt fear and anger boiling inside him. As they pushed him into the back seat, Marcus caught sight of the crowd again, faces mixed with disbelief, anger, and fear. He took a deep breath and raised his voice just enough for those around to hear. "This isn't over," he said, hoping that someone would remember these words, that they would mean something later. "This isn't over." The door slammed shut, trapping Marcus inside a box of steel and glass. He looked out at the crowd, catching the eye of the elderly man who had spoken up for him. The old man gave a small nod, and Marcus felt a flicker of hope, however small, that someone had seen, that someone understood what was really happening here. He held on to that hope as the patrol car drove away, leaving behind a street full of people who were no longer just bystanders but potential witnesses to an injustice. Inside the moving car, Marcus tried to control the trembling in his hands. He closed his eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't know how long this nightmare would last or how it would end, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't alone. Bookmark, go back. The tension became palpable as Marcus Brown, still in disbelief at what was happening, was forced into the back seat of the police car. The sunlight, which had been warm and inviting, now felt harsh as it bore down on the chaotic scene. Around him, the crowd began to gather. People started to stop, their mourning interrupted by the undeniable spectacle of injustice unfolding before them. "He didn't do anything," someone from the crowd shouted. An elderly man, who had been watching from across the street, stepped forward, his voice trembling with indignation. Marcus heard the passion in the stranger's voice, and it brought him a moment of comfort. He wasn't alone. Officers Collins and Edwards continued with their task as if oblivious to the growing chaos around them. Edwards cast a warning glance at the crowd, his hand still resting on his holster. But this only seemed to fuel the crowd's anger. Phones were pulled out, cameras began to record, and every moment of this confrontation was being captured. People were talking, the initial shock quickly turning into outrage. "This is so wrong," a woman pushing a stroller said, her voice carrying across the street. She turned to the young man beside her, who was filming. "Are you getting all of this? They can't do this to him." The young man nodded, his expression one of disbelief. Inside the police car, Marcus could feel the tension of the situation even through the closed doors. He could see the faces of the crowd, a mix of shock, anger, and determination. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, though his heart pounded. He knew what was happening. He knew this scenario all too well, a story that had played out countless times before. And now he was a part of that story. Another name, another face in the long history of unjust arrests. Collins and Edwards exchanged glances as they shut the door on Marcus. There was a brief pause, as if they were trying to see how far they could push the situation before the crowd lost patience with just words. They moved slowly, each step a taunt, a silent reminder of their power. An elderly woman, Agnes Fields, who lived in a nearby apartment, stepped forward. Her voice was frail but filled with anger. "I've seen this young man around here. He's never caused any trouble. This is wrong." She shook her head, her voice trembling with indignation. Marcus caught her gaze through the tinted window, and her courage deeply moved him. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The officers got into the car, Edwards taking the driver's seat, while Collins looked over at Marcus, his expression still hard from their earlier confrontation. Marcus turned away, focusing on the crowd, which was growing larger, spilling into the street, demanding answers. As the car began to roll away, Marcus saw a young boy standing beside his mother, his hand tightly clutching hers. The child's wide eyes stared at the scene, confusion and fear clear in his innocent gaze. Marcus clenched his jaw and looked straight ahead. He couldn't let himself dwell on it, couldn't let the despair take over, not now. He needed to stay focused, needed to stay strong. The police car moved through familiar streets, the siren silent but the tension echoing loudly. Inside, Marcus was overwhelmed with thoughts, his family, his mother waiting for him, and his colleagues at the law office starting to wonder why he hadn't arrived. Fear, injustice, and a sense of helplessness all boiled within him. But he kept his face calm. A mask he had worn in boardrooms, in courtrooms, a mask that refused to show weakness. Suddenly the car stopped. Edwards looked back at Marcus, his eyes devoid of any emotion. "We're bringing you in for further questioning. You match the description of a suspect." The words sounded robotic, rehearsed, devoid of any real meaning. Marcus said nothing. He knew arguing wouldn't help. Anything he said could be twisted to fit their narrative. He turned his head to look out the window, watching the streets he once knew well, now feeling cold and distant. As they pulled up to the police station, Marcus noticed a few reporters already waiting outside. Clearly, they had heard about the arrest, likely thanks to the bystanders who recorded everything. Edwards and Collins exchanged uneasy glances before getting out of the car. Marcus took a deep breath as the door opened and he was pulled out. His wrists throbbed from the cuffs, but he kept his head high, refusing to let them see his pain. He could hear the reporters calling his name, and he focused on that, the fact that his story was getting out, that this injustice wouldn't go unnoticed. The officers led Marcus inside, past the curious stares of other officers who paused to watch. Some faces were indifferent, others slightly confused, as if they knew something wasn't right, but didn't dare say so. Marcus felt a strange mix of humiliation and anger as he was dragged through the station, the weight of all those eyes pressing down on him. He was taken into a small holding cell, the door clanging shut behind him. The sound echoed in the empty room, a stark reminder of his sudden loss of freedom. He sat down on the metal bench, closing his eyes and trying to steady his breathing. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Always stay calm, Marcus. Never let them see you're scared." It was his father's mantra, a lesson drilled into him since he was a child, a lesson that had gotten him through law school, through countless trials, through every challenge life had thrown his way. And now, in this cold, empty room, it was the only thing keeping him steady. Outside the cell, the station buzzed with noise. Collins and Edwards sat at a desk, typing up their report. But the tension in the air was palpable. Lieutenant Jessica Davis, an experienced officer with a reputation for fairness, had heard about the arrest. She watched from her office, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Something didn't sit right with her, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. In the holding cell, Marcus could hear the faint sounds of the station, phones ringing, officers talking, and the occasional echo of footsteps. He opened his eyes and stared at the steel door, his mind racing through every possible outcome, every way to get out of this. He knew his rights. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. But he also knew that the truth didn't always matter in situations like this. He had heard too many stories of men like him being thrown behind bars for no reason other than the color of their skin. The minutes dragged on like hours as Marcus sat in the cell, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, anger, and determination. He wouldn't let this break him. He couldn't. He had fought too hard, come too far to let it all end like this. He thought of his mother, her laughter, her strength, and he clung to that. He had to believe that the truth would come out, that justice would prevail, no matter how long or painful the road might be. The noise outside the cell grew louder, and Marcus looked up, his eyes narrowing. He could hear voices, angry, demanding. It was the crowd from before. They hadn't left. They were here at the station, demanding his release. Marcus felt a rush of emotion, a wave of gratitude and hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. Marcus was led deeper into the police station, the dimly lit hallways seeming to stretch endlessly, each turn becoming more cramped. The noise of the station enveloped him, officers talking, radios crackling, and phones ringing in the distance. Marcus held his head high, the instinct of a lawyer reminding him not to show fear. He knew that now, this wasn't just about him. The eyes of the crowd outside, the cameras that had captured every moment of his arrest, were a reminder that this story would not easily be hidden. Lieutenant Jessica Davis watched from her office window, feeling that something was wrong. She had joined the police force years ago, hoping to make a difference, believing that her badge could stand for integrity and justice. But as she saw Collins and Edwards dragging Marcus past the reception, she felt an indescribable unease. She had read enough reports and heard enough stories to know this wasn't a normal arrest. The aggression, the lack of procedure, all of it set off alarms in her head. She turned away from the window, grabbed her jacket, and stepped out of her office. Marcus was led into the interrogation room, a simple space with gray walls, a metal table, and a light overhead casting a harsh glare on the floor. Collins pushed Marcus into a chair, his hand still on Marcus's shoulder as if daring him to react. Marcus didn't. He just looked up at Collins, his gaze steady, his face calm. He had faced worse than this in courtrooms across the state. He wouldn't let them see him rattled. "Stay put," Collins muttered, his tone dripping with contempt. He and Edwards stepped out, leaving Marcus alone in the room. Marcus exhaled slowly, allowing himself a moment to collect his thoughts. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but he forced himself to focus. He needed to think clearly, needed to plan his next move. Lieutenant Davis intercepted Collins and Edwards as they exited the room. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice calm, but her eyes sharp. Collins smirked, shrugging as if all of this was routine. "Just arresting a suspect. He matches the description of someone involved in suspicious activity in the area." Davis frowned. "And what's the probable cause?" Her eyes didn't leave them, and Collins faltered slightly under her scrutiny. "He was acting suspiciously," Collins replied, but the hesitation in his voice was clear. "Suspicious how?" Davis pressed, her voice growing colder. She had heard enough vague explanations in her career to know when someone was trying to cover something up. Edwards cleared his throat, trying to back up his partner. "He got defensive when we asked for his ID, thought it was worth bringing him in." Davis stared at both of them, her eyes narrowing. "You thought it was worth bringing him in because he got defensive? That's the best reason you've got?" She felt her patience wearing thin, the unease inside her growing. She knew she needed more than their weak justifications. Without another word, Davis brushed past them, heading toward the interrogation room. She paused at the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Marcus looked up as she entered, his eyes meeting hers. There was a moment of silence, a quiet acknowledgement between them, two people who both understood the weight of this moment. "Mr. Brown," Davis said calmly, "I'm Lieutenant Jessica Davis. I'm here to get a better understanding of what happened." She moved to the chair opposite him, sat down, and placed a recorder on the table. Marcus nodded, his eyes steady. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "I appreciate that." Davis could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the burden of what he'd been through. She knew this wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. This was about a system that had failed too many times, about a community that was tired of being targeted. She pressed the record button and leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything." Outside the room, Collins and Edwards exchanged worried glances. They had thought this would go unnoticed, just another quiet arrest that would be forgotten. But Davis's presence, her determination to get to the truth, made them uneasy. They knew things were quickly spiraling out of their control. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the only sound in the cold room as Marcus began to speak. He recounted every moment, from his breakfast at the diner to Collins and Edwards' sudden approach, to the escalating questions without reason. His voice was steady, but there was a fire behind his words, a quiet determination that reflected years of fighting for justice. Davis listened intently, her expression unchanging, her eyes never leaving Marcus as he spoke. When Marcus finished, Davis nodded slowly, her mind racing. She could feel the gravity of the situation, the weight of every decision she made from here. She had dealt with officers like Collins and Edwards before, those who let their biases cloud their judgment, who thought they could get away with bending the rules. But she wasn't going to let that happen today. She stood up, her eyes still on Marcus. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Brown. I'll make sure this is handled properly." Marcus gave a slight nod, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he replied. Davis turned and stepped out of the room, her expression hardening as she approached Collins and Edwards, who were waiting in the hallway. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold, her eyes narrowing. The two officers exchanged nervous looks as she gestured for them to follow. They knew they were in trouble, but they didn't know just how deep they were. As the door to the interrogation room closed behind Davis, Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He knew this was far from over, but for the first time since his arrest, he felt like someone was listening, and maybe, just maybe, justice would be served. The tension in the station hadn't dissipated, and as Lieutenant Davis began digging into the situation, she knew she was about to uncover something bigger than just a wrongful arrest. Stay tuned. This story has only just begun. Lieutenant Jessica Davis walked briskly through the narrow hallway, her face set with determination. Collins and Edwards followed a few steps behind, their anxiety growing with each passing second. Davis led them into a small, windowless office, then turned to face them, closing the door gently but with clear intent. "All right, start talking," she said, her voice low but carrying an unmistakable authority. Her eyes moved from Collins to Edwards and back. "What exactly prompted you to arrest Mr. Brown? And I need more than vague answers about suspicion." Collins shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Edwards as if looking for support. "Lieutenant, we already told you." He seemed evasive. "We asked for his ID, and he got defensive," Collins said, though even he could hear the weakness of the justification. Davis's expression didn't change. "Let me get this straight. You brought him in just because he didn't immediately comply with your request?" "No crime reported, no concrete evidence, just your gut feeling." Her words were sharp, each one cutting deeper. "We thought he might be involved in something," Edwards finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. "I mean, he matched the description of someone acting suspicious in the area." Davis stared at Edwards, her eyes narrowing. "A black man in a suit? That's the description you're talking about?" She shook her head in disbelief, frustration evident. "Do you hear yourselves? You're making decisions based purely on bias and racial profiling." Collins opened his mouth to retort, but closed it again, realizing he had nothing more to say. The room seemed to shrink, the tension growing heavier. Davis sighed, her brow furrowed in disappointment. She knew this kind of behavior wasn't isolated, it reflected a deeper problem within the department. "Listen to me," Davis finally said, her voice calmer but no less serious. "We cannot afford mistakes like this. This isn't just about failing to uphold the law. This could destroy the entire department. Mr. Brown is not just anyone, he's a prominent civil rights attorney who has exposed systemic abuses before." Both officers blinked in surprise, their faces paling. A lawyer?" Collins stammered, the arrogance he had worn earlier now gone. "Yes," Davis said, nodding. "And not just any lawyer. Marcus Brown has been involved in major cases across the state, cases that have exposed abuses just like this. Do you understand the gravity of the situation you've created?" She paused, letting her words sink in. "If he decides to pursue this, we could face a lawsuit that would ruin the department's reputation." Edward swallowed, the realization beginning to set in. He exchanged a glance with Collins, who looked equally stunned. The weight of their mistake bore down on them, all their previous bravado crumbling under Davis's words. Davis crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "Here's what's going to happen. You two are going to write a detailed report of every action you took today. Every detail, every decision you made, and why. I need it on my desk by the end of the day. Understood?" Collins and Edwards nodded silently, neither daring to meet her eyes. "Good," Davis said, "because if you think this is over, you're wrong. This is just the beginning." With that, she turned and opened the door, gesturing for them to leave. The two officers left the room, their shoulders slumped, all confidence completely drained. Davis watched them go, her eyes filled with anger and disappointment. She knew fixing this would take more than a few reports. It was systemic, a rot that had festered for years, and it would take more than just her to change it. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the interrogation room. Marcus was still seated at the metal table, his expression calm, though she could see the questioning look in his eyes as she entered. "Mr. Brown," she began, sitting down across from him, "I've spoken with the officers involved. It's clear this entire incident was a mistake that should never have happened. I want you to know that I'm committed to making sure this is handled properly." Marcus looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant Davis, but you have to understand, this isn't just about me. This is about how people in my community are treated every day. Something has to change." Davis met his eyes, her expression softening slightly. "I know," she said quietly, "and I agree with you. What happened today was wrong, and we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to change that." Marcus leaned back slightly, considering her words. "If that's true, I think we can work together on this, but I need more than words, Lieutenant. I need action." Davis nodded. "You have my word, Mr. Brown. There will be action." She paused for a moment before continuing. "I'm going to release you now. I'll make sure everything is handled properly so you can leave without further trouble." Marcus nodded again, a faint smile crossing his lips, though there was no humor in it. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I hope, for everyone's sake, that you mean what you say." Davis stood up, extending her hand to Marcus, who shook it firmly. In that handshake was an unspoken understanding, a silent agreement that what happened today wasn't the end, but perhaps the beginning of something greater. As Marcus was escorted out of the police station, the tension seemed to ease slightly. Officers watched as he left, some curious, others looking concerned. Outside, the crowd that had gathered earlier was still there, their eyes fixed on the entrance as Marcus stepped out. A murmur ran through the crowd, followed by cheers, people clapping and calling his name. Marcus raised a hand in acknowledgement, his expression one of determination, not victory. Lieutenant Davis stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. She knew this wasn't over, far from it. The real work was only just beginning, both for her and for the department. She needed to gather allies within the force, those willing to help her bring about real change. They had a long road ahead, but she was determined to take the first step. And as Marcus walked down the steps of the police station, surrounded by supporters, one thought echoed in Davis's mind. How many more times would this scene have to repeat before real change came? She didn't know the answer, but she was ready to fight to find out. Stay tuned, this is only the beginning of Marcus Brown's fight for justice. Lieutenant Jessica Davis took a deep breath before stepping into the brightly lit hallway leading to the holding area of the police station. The weight of the day's events and what had happened to Marcus Brown pressing on her conscience. She had to make this right, not just for Marcus, but for the integrity of her team. As she approached the holding area, her expression grew more resolute with each step. Today had spiraled out of control, and she was determined not to let it get any worse. When Davis reached the door to the holding area, she found Officers Collins and Edwards waiting, both looking uneasy under her unwavering gaze. She motioned for them to follow her into a small, windowless room nearby, a space that felt more like a tomb than an office, with stale air and dim lighting that seemed to press in from all sides. "Start talking," Davis demanded, her voice slicing through the silence. The sternness in her tone left no room for misunderstanding. Collins and Edwards exchanged glances, both visibly anxious. "Lieutenant, we thought Marcus was acting suspicious. He didn't comply immediately when we asked for his ID. He seemed evasive," Collins stammered, his usual confidence shattered. Davis narrowed her eyes. "Evasive?" she repeated slowly, her voice filled with disbelief. "You brought him in just because he didn't immediately follow your orders? You understand there's a proper procedure, right? Not just gut feelings and vague suspicions." Edwards tried to explain. He matched the description. A man suspected of loitering. "A man suspected of loitering," Davis repeated, shaking her head. "Let me guess, that description was a black man in a suit. You should know by now that this is not how we operate. You don't arrest people based on racial profiling. You arrest them when you have evidence. Do you understand?" Both officers nodded, clearly shaken. The air in the room grew heavier, the silence deepening as Davis allowed the gravity of the situation to sink in. "Listen carefully," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "Marcus Brown is not just anyone. He's a civil rights attorney. Not just any attorney. He's known across the state for defending those wronged by the system. People like the ones you've just carelessly targeted. Do you understand the position you've put us in?" Collins's mouth opened slightly, but he quickly shut it. Edwards looked like he might faint. "If Marcus decides to take this further," Davis continued, "we could face a lawsuit, and the entire police department, everything we've built, will be at risk. Your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for everyone here." "Lieutenant," Collins said, his voice trembling, "we didn't know." Davis frowned deeply. "You should have known. It's your job. But it's too late now. Here's what's going to happen. You both will prepare a detailed report of everything that happened today. Every action, every decision, every word exchanged. I want it on my desk by the end of the day. Understood?" Both officers nodded, looking thoroughly defeated. "Good," Davis said, her voice cold. "This isn't over for you. This is just the beginning. Now get out." Collins and Edwards left the room, their heads bowed, no longer daring to meet her eyes. As they walked away, Davis let out a heavy sigh, feeling the weight of the collective failure pressing on her shoulders. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a deep-rooted culture of bias and misconduct within the department that needed addressing. If they were going to regain the community's trust, real change was necessary. Davis made her way to the holding cell, where Marcus was being kept. She paused outside, taking a breath before stepping in. Marcus sat on the hard metal chair, his hands resting on his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression calm but questioning. "Mr. Brown," she began, "I've spoken with the officers involved in your arrest. It's clear that this entire situation was a mistake that should never have happened. I'm here to ensure that everything is handled properly." Marcus studied her, his eyes searching. After a moment, he nodded. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant Davis. But you need to understand, this isn't just about me. This is about how my community is treated every day. Something has to change." Davis's gaze softened. "I know, and I agree with you. What happened today was wrong, and we need to make sure this doesn't happen again." Marcus leaned back slightly, considering her words. "If that's true, Lieutenant, then maybe we can work together on this. But I need more than words. I need action." Davis nodded. "You have my word, Mr. Brown. There will be action." She paused, then added, "I'm going to release you now. I'll make sure everything is handled so you can leave without further trouble." Marcus nodded in response, a faint smile crossing his lips, though it lacked humor. "Thank you, Lieutenant. For everyone's sake, I hope you mean it." Davis extended her hand, and Marcus shook it firmly. In that handshake was mutual understanding, a silent agreement that what happened today could be the beginning of something bigger, something that might finally start to change things. Davis escorted Marcus out of the police station, the tension around them fading as they moved toward the exit. A few officers watched as they passed, some curious, others visibly uneasy. Outside, the crowd that had gathered earlier was still there, their eyes fixed on the door. As Marcus stepped out, a murmur ran through the crowd before it turned into applause and cheers. People called his name, and Marcus raised his hand, acknowledging their support. His face, however, was resolute, not triumphant. Lieutenant Davis stood in the doorway, her arms crossed as she watched the scene. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The real work was only just beginning, both for her and for the team. They had a long road ahead, but she was determined to take the first steps. Marcus walked down the steps of the police station, surrounded by a diverse crowd that had gathered in solidarity. He was greeted with pats on the back, hugs, and words of encouragement, their faces a mix of relief, determination, and hope. Amid it all, he looked back at the building, seeing Davis still standing there. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no hostility, just a silent acknowledgement of the road ahead. Davis watched until Marcus disappeared into the crowd. She turned and walked back into the police station, her mind already at work. There was too much to do, too much to fix. The cracks in the system were visible now, and there was no turning away. She had promised Marcus action, and she would keep that promise, not just for him, but for everyone who had been wronged and overlooked. The sun began to set as Marcus stepped out of the police station, the heavy door creaking open to reveal a sea of people waiting. Hundreds had gathered outside, a powerful testament to the community's unwavering support. Signs were held high, and the chant of "Justice for Marcus" echoed repeatedly. The air was charged with a mix of frustration, hope, and anticipation. Camera flashes captured every moment, and all eyes were on Marcus as he emerged, head held high. "This isn't over," Marcus thought to himself, feeling the collective energy surge through him. He knew what he had to do. He had been given an opportunity, and he would not waste it. Silence fell over the crowd as Marcus approached the small podium that had been set up near the steps. The evening air was cool, a slight breeze rustling the signs held high. He looked out at the people who had come to support him, families, activists, students, and elders. Every face carried a different story, but all were united in this moment. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their expectations. The crowd's silence was almost tangible, a sign they were ready to listen. He cleared his throat, the microphone crackling as he leaned in. "Thank you," Marcus began, his voice amplified through the speakers. "Thank you all for being here today, for standing up, for showing up, even when it's hard. Today, what happened to me isn't just about me, it's about all of us. It's about everyone who has ever felt afraid, who has ever been misjudged, who has ever been silenced. Today isn't just my story, it's our story." A round of applause rippled through the crowd, starting small but growing stronger. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. He could see their faces, some filled with cautious hope, others still etched with fear, but all attentive. He knew they needed more than words, they needed direction, a call to action. "We deserve better." Marcus's voice grew stronger, resonating with conviction. "We deserve a system that treats us with respect and dignity. We deserve police officers who protect us, not target us. What happened today was wrong, and it happens far too often to far too many people. I am lucky to be walking out of that police station, but countless others are not. And that is why we cannot stay silent any longer." Cheers of agreement rose from the crowd, mingled with shouts of support. Marcus stepped away from the microphone slightly, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. He saw a young boy sitting on his father's shoulders, watching with wide, curious eyes, and an elderly woman holding a sign that read, "Justice for All." Marcus felt the weight of those gazes, and it fueled his resolve. He raised his hand, signaling for silence once more. "We need more than apologies," Marcus said, his voice clear and direct. "Words aren't enough. Promises aren't enough. We need change, real, tangible change. We need accountability. We need transparency. We need those in power to understand that we will accept nothing less than fairness and justice, and we will not stop until we get it." The crowd erupted into applause, cheers filling the evening air. It was the release of frustration, of pain that had long been ignored. Marcus let the noise wash over him for a moment, then continued, his voice unwavering. "Today I stand here as just one man," he said, "but I am not alone. We are stronger together. This is a movement, and it belongs to all of us. We need to demand that city officials listen. We need to demand that police officers are trained not just in law enforcement but in compassion. We need to demand that they see us as fellow human beings, not as threats." Marcus paused, his eyes hardening. "And if they won't listen, then we will make them listen. We march, we vote, we call, we write, we do whatever it takes until everyone, regardless of race, background, or circumstance, is treated with the respect they deserve." A chant began to rise from the crowd, starting with a small group at the front and spreading like a wave. "No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace." The rhythm of the words echoed through the streets, reverberating off the buildings surrounding the square. Marcus stood there, letting the chant grow, feeling the power of the voices around him. This was the beginning of something larger, something unstoppable. "You have the power," Marcus continued, his voice rising above the chants. "Each of you has the power to make a difference. This is not just about me, it's about us, about our children. The actions we take today will shape the world they grow up in. Let's make sure it's a world they can be proud of." The cheers of the crowd reached a crescendo, and Marcus felt a wave of emotions swell within him. This was what it meant to be part of something greater than oneself. This was the fight for justice, and it was far from over. "I want all of you to go home tonight and remember this moment," Marcus said, his voice full of determination. "Remember what it felt like to stand together, to demand what is right. And tomorrow we keep going. We keep fighting. We keep showing up. Because that is the only way we will see real change." He looked out at the crowd one last time, his gaze locking with that of a young woman holding a camera. She was capturing everything, her face a mixture of determination and hope. Marcus nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of her role in this movement, in speaking the truth, in ensuring the world saw what was happening here. "This isn't over," Marcus repeated, his voice steady. "Not until justice is a reality for all of us. Thank you for standing with me today. Let's keep moving forward, together." As Marcus stepped down from the podium, the crowd surged forward, cheers and applause echoing through the square. People reached out to touch his hand, to shake it, to offer words of encouragement. Marcus smiled, though his expression remained serious. He knew this was just one step in a much longer journey. He continued to move through the crowd, stopping to speak with community leaders and organizers who had been instrumental in bringing everyone together. They exchanged ideas, talked strategy, and began planning the next steps. It wasn't enough to gather for one evening. This had to be a sustained effort. They needed to ensure their voices would be heard long after the news cameras left. As Marcus continued, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he saw a young teenager, no older than 15, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Mr. Brown," the boy said, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "I just wanted to say, thank you. What you said really means a lot." Marcus knelt slightly, meeting the boy's gaze. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Derek," the boy replied. "Well, Derek," Marcus said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, "it's people like you who will change the world. Never forget that your voice matters. Keep speaking up, keep standing up for what's right. We need you." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with a mix of pride and determination. Marcus stood, nodding to Derek once more before continuing through the crowd. Eventually, as night fell and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus found himself standing next to Lieutenant Jessica Davis. She had come outside, standing on the edge, her posture tense, her eyes scanning the scene with a mixture of contemplation and concern, watching the protest unfold. Their eyes met, and she gave him a slight nod. "That was powerful," she said, her voice barely audible over the fading noise. Marcus looked at her, searching for sincerity in her eyes. "Words are powerful, Lieutenant," he replied, "but actions are even more so. Let's see what happens next." Davis nodded again, her expression thoughtful. "Agreed. We will make sure there is action." Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer before turning back to the crowd. This was far from over. This was just the beginning of a much larger fight. And as he looked at those who had gathered, he knew they were ready for whatever lay ahead. As the last light of the day began to fade, Marcus Brown took a moment to reflect on what had transpired earlier that day, the powerful protest, the voices raised in unity, and the collective demand for justice. Outside, the echoes of chants from the protest still lingered, a reminder that justice was never just about one person. This was merely the first step in a long journey, a story without an ending. The next morning, Marcus had an important meeting at the community center. Community leaders, social activists, and dedicated police officers, including well-known activist Rachel Thompson and Officer James Stevens, gathered to discuss the next steps. These were crucial meetings, but also moments for each person to see the commitment of those around them. "We must reform the system from within," Marcus told the group. "These changes won't be easy, but if we are committed, we will meet the demands of justice and fairness." Ideas began to take shape during the discussion. Police would be retrained, and classes on compassion and cultural awareness, covering topics like implicit bias, community engagement, and de-escalation techniques, would be added to their training programs. For example, officers would participate in role-playing exercises to better understand diverse community perspectives. Marcus knew that these steps would take time to show results, but he was not discouraged. With the support of the community, he knew change would come. He urged everyone to maintain the enthusiasm and dedication they had shown yesterday. If you want to see real change, he said, we must be the ones to start it. The effects of the protest continued to ripple out day by day, inspiring more community members to get involved. Local businesses began offering support for community initiatives, schools hosted discussions on social justice, and even the city council started reconsidering some of its policies on policing. Inside the police station, Lieutenant Jessica Davis was beginning a serious investigation into issues within the police force. She knew this fight could not end with protests alone. It required real action from within. She called on motivated officers like Stevens who could contribute to a better future for the community. She organized training sessions to help officers better understand their roles and learn how to respond in a humane way. The efforts of the community did not stop either. Marcus led initiatives to improve the rights of those in need, such as organizing a legal aid clinic that successfully helped several low-income families resolve housing disputes. He organized many community outreach events, providing a platform for people to share their problems, offer suggestions, and find solutions together. We've come a long way, but this is just the beginning, Marcus said at a public meeting. We still have a lot of work to do, and every step we take today will shape the future for generations to come. He reminded everyone that if they wanted to see change, they had to stay united and keep acting, because only through continuous effort could justice truly permeate society. After the community event, Marcus stepped outside and watched children playing in the park. Scenes of a community gradually changing for the better. He knew that this was an unending journey, but at the same time, it was a new opportunity for everyone to leave a positive mark on future generations. Justice is never simple, Marcus said, looking at Lieutenant Davis, who was standing beside him. But if we keep going, if we don't give up, we will see change. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. Let's continue this fight for justice together.